I paid off my parents' house. I paid all their bills. I made sure they lived comfortably without any worries. But one sentence from them shattered everything. Your younger sibling cares more than you do. How could all my sacrifices be overshadowed just because I wasn't always there emotionally? This isn't about money anymore. It's about the sense of being appreciated that I've never received. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let me invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Type in the comments section which city you live in. I honestly never imagined my life would unfold this way, or that something I once believed would bring my family closer together would instead create a quiet, lingering distance between us. For years, I lived with a single, unwavering goal in mind. While other people my age were spending on things they enjoyed, travel, hobbies, nights out, I was carefully budgeting every dollar, constantly thinking about the future of my parents. I watched them struggle for so long, juggling bills, worrying about the mortgage, and making sacrifices they never openly talked about, but that I could clearly see. It stayed with me, that quiet pressure, that unspoken weight in the house. It became something I carried too. So I made a decision early on that I would do whatever it took to change that for them. I worked longer hours than I probably should have. I took on extra responsibilities, chased promotions, and said yes to opportunities even when I was already exhausted. There were nights I barely slept, weeks where I felt completely burned out, but I kept pushing because I believed it would all mean something in the end. Every bonus, every raise, every bit of progress wasn't just for me. It was part of a bigger plan I had built in my head, one where my parents could finally breathe without worrying about money. Over time, that plan slowly started becoming real. My savings grew, my career stabilized, and eventually I reached a point where I could do what once felt impossible. I paid off the remaining balance on their house. Just like that, the biggest burden they had been carrying for years was gone. No more mortgage hanging over their heads. No more constant anxiety about keeping up with payments. And I didn't stop there. I took over their monthly bills too, utilities, maintenance, anything that could ease their load. I wanted them to feel secure, to finally experience a kind of peace they hadn't known in a long time. I still remember the moment I told them, the look on their faces, shock, disbelief, then gratitude. They hugged me, thanked me, told me how proud they were. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly the way I had imagined it would. It felt like all those years of sacrifice had led to something meaningful, something that truly mattered. I thought this would be a turning point for our family, the beginning of a new chapter where things felt lighter, warmer, more connected. But even in that moment, there was a small part of me, something I couldn't quite explain, that wondered if I had built up this expectation too much in my head. I had tied so much of my effort, my time, and even my identity to this idea of helping them, of being the one who could fix things. And while I never expected anything extravagant in return, I think deep down I hoped it would change how they saw me, how they valued what I brought to the family. I thought it would finally show them just how much I cared, even if I didn't always express it in the most emotional or visible ways. At the time, I pushed that thought aside. I told myself I was overthinking, that what mattered was that they were taken care of. That should have been enough. And for a while, I truly believed it was. At first, everything seemed to fall into place just as I had hoped, almost like the outcome I had spent years working toward was finally unfolding in real time. My parents appeared genuinely relieved, lighter in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. The constant tension that used to linger in conversations about bills and expenses seemed to fade, replaced with a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar but comforting. They thanked me more than once, sometimes in quiet, almost understated ways, and other times with visible emotion that made me feel like all the years of effort had truly mattered. In those early days, there was a softness in how they spoke to me, a warmth that made me think maybe this really did change something between us. We started having more relaxed conversations, sitting together without that underlying stress that used to shape the mood of the room. There were moments where they would bring up the house, almost in disbelief, as if they were still processing the fact that it was fully paid off. They told relatives about what I had done, and I could hear the pride in their voices when they spoke about me. For a while, I let myself settle into that feeling. It wasn't about recognition in a grand sense, but it felt good to know that what I had done was seen, that it had made a real impact on their lives. But slowly, almost so subtly that I didn't notice it at first, the tone began to shift. It didn't happen overnight, and there wasn't a single moment I could point to as the turning point. Instead, it crept in through small comments, passing remarks that seemed harmless on the surface but lingered longer than they should have. Conversations that used to center around shared relief or appreciation began to take a different direction. Somehow, my younger brother's name started coming up more often, woven into discussions where it hadn't really belonged before. At first, I didn't think much of it. Families talk about everyone. It's normal. But then the comparisons started, indirect at first, almost disguised as casual observations. They would mention how he had called them recently just to check in, or how he had stopped by unexpectedly and spent time with them. The way they spoke about those moments carried a kind of emotional weight that made me pause. It wasn't just that they were sharing updates. It was the way those updates were framed, as if those small gestures held a deeper significance. Over time, those comparisons became harder to ignore. It started to feel like every conversation circled back to him in some way, like there was an invisible scale constantly being balanced between us. Even when they didn't say it outright, I could feel the implication hanging in the air that what he offered them emotionally somehow carried more meaning than everything I had done financially. And that realization didn't hit all at once. It built gradually, each comment adding to a quiet sense of confusion I couldn't fully shake. What made it more difficult was that nothing was ever said directly. There was no clear acknowledgement that something had changed, no open conversation about expectations or feelings. It was all implied, existing in the space between words, in the tone of their voices, in what they chose to highlight and what they didn't. I found myself replaying conversations in my head afterward, wondering if I was reading too much into things, or if there really was a shift happening right in front of me. I tried to hold onto the way things felt in the beginning, reminding myself of those first moments of gratitude and relief. I told myself that maybe this was just a phase, that I was overanalyzing normal family dynamics. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore the pattern forming. What once felt like appreciation slowly started to feel conditional, as if what I had done was being quietly reevaluated against something entirely different, something I wasn't sure I even knew how to measure. My brother, on the other hand, had always moved through life in a completely different way than I did, almost as if we had grown up under the same roof, but learned entirely separate rules about responsibility and direction. While I was planning, saving, and pushing myself toward stability, he seemed to drift from one phase to another without any real sense of urgency. He would pick up a job, stay for a few months, then leave, sometimes by choice, sometimes because things didn't work out. There were stretches where he wasn't working at all, just figuring things out, as he liked to put it. And somehow, that explanation was always enough for our parents. It wasn't that I expected him to live exactly the way I did or to make the same choices. People take different paths, and I understood that. But what I struggled with was the consistency of the pattern and the way it was always interpreted in the most forgiving light. When he quit a job, it wasn't seen as instability. It was framed as him searching for something meaningful. When he spent months without income, it wasn't irresponsibility. It was described as him taking time to reset. Every decision, no matter how questionable it might have seemed from the outside, was given a layer of understanding that I couldn't help but notice I never received. What made it even more confusing was how little was actually expected of him in return. There were no serious conversations about long-term plans, no pressure to contribute financially, no sense that he needed to step up in any tangible way. Instead, the focus was always on how he felt, what he was going through, and how important it was for him to find his own path. My parents would defend him without hesitation, often before anyone even criticized him. It was as if they had already decided that he needed protection, that he deserved patience above all else. Meanwhile, I found myself held to a completely different standard, one that was never explicitly stated but always present. Responsibility, consistency, results. Those were simply expected from me, almost as if they were baseline requirements rather than choices I had actively worked toward. There was no narrative built around my efforts, no reinterpretation that softened the edges of what I did. If I succeeded, it was what I was supposed to do. If I struggled, it was something I needed to fix. The contrast wasn't loud, but it was constant, and over time it became impossible to ignore. I started noticing how conversations about him carried a certain tone, one filled with empathy and emotional investment. They would talk about his struggles as if they were deeply connected to him, as if understanding him was a priority. They knew how he felt, what he was thinking, what he was trying to achieve, even if those things were unclear or constantly changing. With me, the conversations were different. They were more practical, more surface level, often centered around what I was doing rather than how I was feeling. It created a strange imbalance, one where I was present in a functional sense but distant in an emotional one. There were moments when I wondered if I had unintentionally contributed to this dynamic. I wasn't the type to call just to talk or to share every detail about my life. I showed up in other ways, through actions, through support, through making sure things were taken care of. But seeing how much weight my parents placed on emotional presence made me question whether those actions were being interpreted the way I thought they were. It felt like we were operating in completely different languages of care, and somehow his version was the one that translated more clearly to them. Even when I tried to look at things objectively, to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, the imbalance remained. It wasn't just about what he did or didn't do. It was about how everything was perceived, explained, and ultimately valued. And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that this wasn't a temporary phase or a misunderstanding. It was a deeply rooted dynamic that had likely existed for years, only now becoming more visible to me because of everything I had invested and everything I had hoped would change. The moment that truly broke something in me didn't come during a loud argument or a dramatic confrontation. It happened quietly, almost casually, in a way that made it even harder to process. I wasn't even meant to be part of the conversation. I had come by the house unexpectedly one afternoon, planning to drop off a few things and maybe stay for a short visit. As I walked in, I could hear my parents talking in the next room. They didn't realize I was there yet, and for a second, I hesitated, not wanting to interrupt. That hesitation turned into something else when I heard my brother's name come up, followed by a sentence that made me stop completely in my tracks. They were saying that he was the one who truly cared about them, that in their eyes, his presence meant more than anything else. One of them mentioned how he always made time to sit with them, to ask how they were feeling, to listen in a way that felt genuine and comforting. Then came the part that hit the hardest. They compared that to me. They said that while I had done a lot for them, financially, it didn't carry the same emotional weight, that what I gave came from a place of obligation, or at least that's how it felt to them, whereas what he gave felt personal, intentional, and full of heart. I remember standing there, completely still, trying to process what I was hearing. It wasn't just the comparison. It was the way they framed my actions, as if everything I had done over the years had been reduced to something transactional, as if the countless hours I had worked, the stress I had carried, the sacrifices I had made, all existed in a separate category that didn't quite reach them on a deeper level. It felt like they were drawing a line between financial support and emotional care, and placing me firmly on the side that mattered less. What made it even more painful was how certain they sounded. There was no hesitation in their voices, no sense that they were questioning their own perspective. To them, this wasn't a complicated or nuanced issue. It was clear, almost obvious. My brother connected with them emotionally, and that connection was what they valued most. I, on the other hand, was seen as someone who helped in practical ways but remained distant, detached, maybe even a little cold. Hearing that interpretation of myself, especially coming from them, felt surreal. I started replaying everything in my head in that moment, trying to understand how they could see me that way. I thought about all the times I had chosen responsibility over comfort, all the decisions I had made with them in mind. None of it had felt like an obligation to me. It had felt like care, like commitment, like love expressed in the most concrete way I knew how. But standing there, listening to them, it became clear that the intention behind my actions wasn't translating into the meaning I thought it carried. There was also a strange sense of distance in how they talked about me, as if I wasn't fully present in their emotional world. They spoke about my brother with familiarity and closeness, referencing specific moments, conversations, shared experiences. With me, it was broader, more generalized, almost like they were describing a role rather than a person. It made me wonder if, somewhere along the way, I had become defined by what I provided rather than who I was to them. I didn't walk into the room right away. I couldn't. I needed a moment to steady myself, to make sense of the mix of emotions building inside me: hurt, confusion, disbelief, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name at the time. It felt like a shift had happened, like a realization I couldn't unhear. Up until that point, I had been holding on to the belief that my efforts spoke for themselves, that even if they weren't always acknowledged directly, they were understood. But in that moment, I realized that understanding wasn't there in the way I had imagined. When I finally did step into the room, they acted normally, unaware of what I had just heard. And that almost made it worse. The conversation moved on. The day continued, but something in me had changed. I couldn't look at things the same way anymore. What had once felt like a shared sense of purpose now felt one-sided, like I had been giving everything into a version of our relationship that didn't actually exist in the way I thought it did. I tried to handle it calmly at first, telling myself that if I approached the situation with honesty instead of anger, maybe we could actually understand each other. I didn't want to turn it into a confrontation, even though part of me felt deeply hurt and unsettled. So I chose a moment when things were quiet, when there was no immediate tension in the air, and I brought it up carefully. I told them that I had overheard what they said. I didn't accuse them right away. I just explained how it made me feel, how hearing that my efforts were seen as less meaningful had stayed with me and was difficult to shake off. At first, they seemed surprised, almost caught off guard that I had heard that conversation at all. There was a brief pause, the kind where it feels like everything could go in different directions depending on what is said next. I hoped that pause meant they were reflecting, maybe realizing how their words might have affected me. But instead of acknowledging that, the conversation quickly shifted into something else. They started explaining themselves in a way that didn't feel like understanding. It felt like justification. They said I was taking it too personally, that I was focusing too much on the financial aspect of what I had done. According to them, it wasn't about comparing who did more or who gave more, but about the type of connection they felt. They emphasized that my brother made them feel heard, that he spent time with them without any expectations, that his presence wasn't tied to responsibility or obligation. The more they spoke, the more it felt like they were reinforcing the exact point that had hurt me in the first place, just with different words. I tried to explain that for me, everything I had done came from a genuine place. I wasn't keeping score, I wasn't trying to buy appreciation, and I certainly wasn't acting out of duty alone. I told them that providing for them was how I expressed care, how I made sure they didn't have to carry the same burdens anymore. But instead of meeting me halfway, they interpreted what I was saying as defensiveness. They said I sounded like I was expecting recognition or something in return, and that made things even more frustrating because that wasn't what I was asking for. As the conversation went on, it became more tense, more circular. Every time I tried to clarify my feelings, it seemed to come back to the same conclusion in their eyes, that I was too focused on what I had done, that I was measuring love in practical terms. They even suggested that maybe I needed to be more emotionally available, more present in ways that didn't involve money or responsibility. Hearing that felt like being reduced to a single dimension of myself, as if everything else I was trying to communicate wasn't being heard at all. What hurt the most wasn't just that they disagreed with me, but that they didn't seem to recognize the emotional side of what I had given. To them, it remained categorized as something separate, something less personal. And no matter how I tried to bridge that gap in understanding, it felt like we were speaking completely different languages. I was trying to explain that my actions were rooted in care, while they were trying to explain that care, to them, looked entirely different. Eventually, the conversation reached a point where it wasn't really going anywhere. We weren't yelling, but there was a clear sense of distance that hadn't been there before. I could tell they felt misunderstood, just as much as I did. But instead of bringing us closer, that shared frustration only widened the gap. I left that discussion feeling more uncertain than when I started, questioning whether I had approached it the wrong way, or if there was simply no way to make them see things from my perspective. Afterward, I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, wondering if I had said too much or not enough, if there was a better way to express what I was feeling. But no matter how I looked at it, one thing remained clear. I had tried to open up, to be honest about something that genuinely hurt me, and instead of finding understanding, I walked away feeling like my intentions had been misread entirely. Since that conversation, I've been carrying around a quiet sense of doubt that I can't seem to shake, no matter how much I try to reason my way through it. It's not loud or overwhelming all the time. It's more like a constant background presence, something that lingers in the way I think about my family, about my role, about everything I believed I understood. I find myself questioning not just what happened, but what it all means. Was I wrong to feel hurt by what they said? Did I misinterpret their words? Or is this simply a reality I hadn't fully seen until now? I keep going back to the choices I made over the years, replaying them in a different light. At the time, everything felt clear. I had a goal, a purpose, and I followed it with everything I had. But now, I wonder if I built that purpose on an assumption that if I gave enough, if I showed up in the most tangible ways possible, it would naturally translate into emotional closeness or recognition. And maybe that assumption was flawed from the start. Maybe I was trying to solve an emotional need with practical actions, hoping they would eventually meet in the middle. At the same time, it's hard for me to accept that what I did could be seen as anything less than meaningful. I didn't act out of obligation in the way they described, even if that's how it came across. There were countless moments where I could have chosen an easier path, where I could have focused only on myself, but I didn't. I chose them again and again, even when it was difficult, even when it meant putting parts of my own life on hold. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Or does the intention behind an action lose its value if it isn't expressed in a way the other person understands? I've also started to look more closely at the difference between being present and being supportive, and how those two things aren't always perceived the same way. My brother's presence, his conversations, his time, that's something they feel directly, something immediate and visible. My support, on the other hand, exists more in the background. It's in the absence of stress, the lack of financial worry, the stability that allows everything else to function. It's less visible, less emotional on the surface, and maybe that's why it's easier to overlook or take for granted. There's a part of me that wonders if I should have done things differently, if I should have made more effort to connect with them in the ways they clearly value. Maybe I relied too much on actions and not enough on words, assuming they would understand what I meant without needing it to be spelled out. But then again, relationships are supposed to work both ways. Understanding shouldn't fall entirely on one side. It shouldn't require someone to constantly translate themselves just to be seen accurately. Now, I find myself at a kind of crossroads, emotionally more than anything else. I'm not angry in the way I expected I might be. I'm more uncertain than that. Uncertain about how to move forward, about how much to give, about what healthy boundaries might look like in a situation like this. Part of me still wants to believe that things can shift, that understanding can grow over time. But another part of me is starting to accept that I may need to adjust my expectations, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. In the end, I keep coming back to one question that I can't quite answer yet. Is this really about who did more or who gave more? Or is it about something deeper? About how love is expressed, received, and recognized differently by each person? Because if that's the case, then maybe this isn't a problem that can be solved by doing more or saying more. Maybe it's something that requires a different kind of acceptance, one where I learn to separate what I give from how it's perceived, and find a way to move forward without letting that disconnect define my sense of worth.